be here, particularly after such a glorious and slightly erroneous introduction. If you don't mind me saying so, Jeremy. Not Charleston Manor. And sorry, this is my horrible sort of streak of pedantry about to come in, which I can't possibly be described as a member of the Bloomsbury group. Because I'm just a little bit too young, even in present company. But yes, my grandmother, my great-aunt, my uncle, etc., all have that claim to fame, but I do not. And I was humbly third generation Jeremy, so thank you all the same. So I'm not sure I'm even capable of speaking because Richard Davenport Hines, who's sitting next to me, has just told me the most filthy story I've ever heard. And I can't get a certain image out of my head. So it's not like I didn't have too many glasses of wine, because otherwise it might come out, but you'll just have to prevail on Richard to either tell you secretly and privately and individually. But it was just, I don't quite know what to do with the image you've just described to me. But it's lovely to be on the platform with Richard and also with Matthew Rice today, both of whom are wonderful supporters of Charleston and visited us in the East Sussex, the glories of East Sussex and the South Downs. And I'm fond of them both, and I was terribly pleased to find out that they were the people I've been speaking with today. So now I've been told not more than 10 minutes, and it's great to talk to an audience of oldie readers, because I've written a book about the 1950s, and I have a suspicion that not absolutely everyone in this room, but probably most, may well have been alive as I was. No, I wasn't. When the Queen came to the throne, I actually can't make that claim to fame, I was born a couple of years later. But many of you may have, unless you know she came to the throne in 1953, and has now been on it for longer than any other monarch. But so many of you may even remember her coronation, you may even have watched it on television. So I feel that probably a large number of people in this room are connected to the decade that I've written about in very formative ways. And so certainly does apply to me, because I was born right bang in the middle of it in 1955. And so the book is about women in the 1950s. And the title is Perfect Wives in Ideal Homes, the story of women in the 1950s. And that title, I hope, has just sufficient irony to it to make you think we are setting up here a situation of not being able to be perfect. And that is indeed what will emerge. Now, the problem of writing about remembered history is that everybody remembers it differently. And I do use a lot of interviews when I'm doing research. So really what I try to do as a social historian is to think, okay, I'm going to embrace this great miscellany of people. I'm not going to try to produce one theme, one conclusion. I'm going to let everyone speak, let everyone have their voice. And what the book does, therefore, is try to tell the story of a really quite complicated decade through a cross-section of society who were the women living at that time. And obviously I haven't got time to tell you all about them, but I just wanted to give you a few examples. It's narrative history, it's not academic, it's storytelling in a sense. It's a sort of soap opera in a sense. So throughout the book, you'll be following the stories of the people who I've interviewed, whose diaries, whose letters, whose memoirs I've trawled through. And these include, for example, an air hostess. Now, every young woman wanted to be an air hostess in 1954. It was top of the tree, literally. I interviewed one of Princess Margaret's ladies-in-waiting. Princess Margaret's story is key to the 1950s. Her debut with Group Captain Peter Townsend. It's been told many times, but it fascinated me in a sense. Princess Margaret and her sister, the Queen, are two sides of the same coin of 1950s womanhood. I interviewed the wife of a Derbyshire miner and a teenage teddy girl who had been photographed by the very young Ken Russell hanging out in West London in her teenage teddy girl gear, circa 1957. I interviewed a woman who'd been a communist when she was at Cambridge. It affected the rest of her life, it affected the rest of her career. She still, when speaking to me, was bitter about what that brief interlude of 1 year while joining the Student Communist Party had done to her career. I interviewed an upper-class debutante, a woman who had done the London season and discovered that because the London season was all about marriage, it wasn't going to work for her, because although she didn't realise it at the time, she didn't love men, she loved women. I interviewed a beauty queen. The beauty queen was Miss Great Britain in 1957, and a nurse who came over from Jamaica and did her nursing training in Eastbourne in 1959. I interviewed a Butlins redcoat. One of the most moving stories I discovered was that of a woman who was, like so many, this being pre-pill, became pregnant and had to give her baby away for adoption. And that was, I think after 3 hours talking to this woman in her bungalow in Yarmouth, we were both in tears. It was something she never got over, having to give away that child. So the journey that I made while looking at the 1950s seemed in some ways like a journey to another planet. I may have been alive at the time, we all may have been, but in some ways the landscape was almost unrecognisable. As well as memoirs, as well as interviews, I looked at advice manuals. The message and films and advertisements and women's magazines and all that kind of thing. I wanted to find out how women were supposed to be, and what emerged, no surprises here probably, was that the only way to be complete was that you had to be a wife. You had to be a wife and a mother. If you look at the Shilling manual, How to Get Your Man, for example, the message that comes through in this handy leaflet is, whatever you do, if you want to get your man to the altar, you have to be childlike and feminine. Whatever you do, don't be clever. Don't talk cleverly to men, because men are terrified of brainy women. And above all, don't ever beat your man at tennis. These are the kind of things that women are being told. Women's magazines told them, whatever you do, don't slouch at bus stops. This is about boys. Take a flannel every morning and slap yourself under the chin with it, because this will prevent you getting a double chin. And it gives careful instructions on how to walk upstairs in such a way that your bust won't wobble. How to groom yourself. Advertisements too. Evening in Paris. Rivita, the fairy tale figure of the woman who eats Rivita. Stay young, keep a lilt in your step. Lucy Clayton is probably a name. You go to Lucy Clayton Model Agency and learn how to, I must increase my bust, all that kind of wonderful, shorts and tops, and the Women's League of Health and Beauty look. Make sure your shoes, your handbag and your lipstick all tone match. Glorify Yourself was a book I found. This was all incredibly important stuff. These little matters of personal attractiveness mean the difference between riches and poverty, marriage or spinsterhood, wedding bliss or broken homes. And these differences are not trifles. So they're not to be taken lightly. They were important. It was really about staying beautiful and young, pampering your husband, above all making sure that your husband, once you got into the altar, was kept there. Punctual meals, So often, you know, you have to have your meals on the table at 5:18 precisely because your husband took 18 minutes to go from his factory on his motorbike back home, and he wanted it hot as he walked in the door. And make sure too that when he walks in the door, you're not wearing your horrible old house coat. You put on a little bit of makeup and taken the rollers out of your hair. If you don't do all those things, and if you're not good in bed, because this was the era of the Kinsey report and these things were starting to be talked about, he will run away with another woman, make no mistake about it. So these were the messages that were coming through loud and clear in the 1950s. It was an era of beauty contests. It was an era of baby shows. If you couldn't do it for yourself, you could at least have a beautiful baby to show for it. And of course it was the era of consumerism. These were the never had it so good days. Young Conservative membership was at an all-time high. So was membership of the Women's Institute. And it was a time of full employment. It was a time when, if you were a teenager who'd left school probably at 14, you could walk into a job in the chewing gum factory, move on next week to a job in the light bulb factory, and proceed the following day to packing biscuits if that's what you wanted, because there was no problem about getting jobs. And with the money that you earned, you could save up, you could get married, then you would be working post-marriage in the same sort of very low status jobs, and you would buy a refrigerator, vinyl records, and a television set, because those were what ensured your status and your comfort. Austerity was left behind by 1956. We were all getting into the consumer society we all know and love. So from a distance, I think we do feel a sort of nostalgia for that world. I'm not immune to it. Black and white movies, retro decor, and gorgeous wives with perfect coiffures and radiant smiles, wearing frilly aprons and making wonderful batches of fairy cakes. Queens in their kitchens with access to all that marvellous modernity, fish fingers, Formica, and commercial television. So for me, there was something of a nostalgia fest here. So much that I remembered, like Spangles, Shipman's fish paste, Pond's cold cream, all-on cardigans, Players Navy cut, Morris Travellers, remember? Holiday camps, hostess trolleys, and coronation chicken, not to be forgotten. And farthings, remember farthings? And those lovely russet 10-shilling notes. A time when a pound seemed like untold wealth. Do you sense a but coming up? 1.2% of women school leavers went to university at this time. That's my first but. Hardly any of whom were working class. One I did talk to, a woman who was working class who went to university, fought her way through. She paid the price. Women learned, on average, 59% of male earnings in, as I've described, low-status jobs. Probably 23% of women at that time had any sex education at all. It would seem that most women of our mothers, our grandmothers' generation, born in the 20s and 30s or earlier, were woefully ignorant about how their own bodies worked or what they were for. A time of terrifyingly high figures for illegal abortion. The Abortion Law Reform Society estimated in 1947 that there were 100,000 illegal abortions in this country a year. And a time of street prostitution, when out there in the Strand and indeed across London, after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, women were for sale knee-deep on the pavements. Not knee-deep, that's not bad. Sorry. A few other pointers there. Ruth Ellis. That's a name that will mean something to I think a lot of you in this room. A woman who went to the gallows having murdered her lover. Today, had she been tried, I think that the abuse and humiliation to which he'd subjected her would undoubtedly have ensured a short sentence.